This video is going to focus on some government initiatives to promote civil rights for African Americans in the latter stages of the middle portion of the 1900s. So it's going to be a combination of Supreme Court cases we're going to look at. So that's the judicial branch, amendments, which are partially Congress' responsibility, and laws, which are sort of like responsibility of first Congress to make them and the president to sign them into law. So the first sort of thing that we're going to focus on is the infamous decision of Brown v. Topeka Board of Education that was issued in 1954. And this was the verdict that essentially declared racial segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional. And the video gives you a little background information on Linda Brown and this legal fight that ensued.
On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. The court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. This decision grew out of several cases that challenged racial segregation in schools across America. Because the lawsuits addressed the same legal questions, the Supreme Court consolidated them into one case. Its lead plaintiff was Oliver Brown. He sued the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education on behalf of his daughter, Linda. She was a black public school student who lived just a few blocks from an elementary school in Topeka. However, she was forced to travel over an hour to reach the all-black school she was assigned to attend. When she tried to enroll in the closer neighborhood school, which was all white, the request was denied. In the U.S. Supreme Court, Brown was represented by NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall. He argued that segregated schools were harmful and left black children with feelings of inferiority. The court unanimously decided in Brown's favor, declaring that separate educational facilities were, without exception, unequal. Chief Justice Earl Warren declared that, quote, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place." And while it didn't happen immediately, this ruling paved the way for integration.
So it gives you a little overview of this infamous verdict, this decision by the Supreme Court. It only applies to areas of public education, which is important to note. So segregation is abolished in public schools, but is still intact in other remaining areas of society. That would essentially be demolished by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So Brown v. Board deals with ending of segregation in public schools, and approximately 10 years later, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was signed by President Johnson, sort of ends segregation in all other areas of American society.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. Divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice.
So this gives you a little bit of understanding of the significance of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ends legalized segregation in all other areas of American society. And then a year later, you begin to see the movement, the civil rights movement, shift focus and try to fight against the remaining barriers that prevented African Americans from being able to exercise the right to vote. This is a picture of the famous voting rights march that took place in Alabama, where it was a 4-day march from Selma, Alabama, to the capital of Alabama, which was Montgomery. And it was meant to draw attention to the inequities involved with all the barriers that were still in existence that prevented African Americans from voting. The impact of that march and similar marches is that there were changes that came. First, in 1964 was the 24th Amendment. That abolishes the poll tax, which we talked about previously, the need to pay in order to vote. That was abolished in 1964 by the 24th Amendment. The marches were really significant in leading towards the 65 Voting Rights Act being signed, which really prohibited all of the other racial barriers to voting, such as like literacy tests, voting vouchers, grandfather clauses, and those things. And again, it was the pressure applied by Dr. King and this movement that led to these like legislative changes. And this is Johnson again announcing the Voting Rights Act.
It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
So again, the 65 Voting Rights Act is monumental in eliminating all those other barriers that prevented African Americans from being able to vote. And then the last one we're going to focus on is the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which made it illegal to refuse to sell or rent housing due to race. And we'll focus a little bit more on sort of the legacy of a lot of the discriminatory housing policies, but this is a pretty impactful piece of legislation that was passed as well. So again, it's a combination of court cases, amendments, and laws passed by Congress that all have the ability to try and advance the country towards equality and civil rights for African Americans.